Hello there, curious minds. I'm your guide, and yes, I'm an eagle. Why? Because I have a sharp eye for history. And this colossal empire requires an aerial perspective. We are traveling back in time to 550 BC, long before smartphones, the internet, or even remotely accurate maps. Forget everything you've seen in those exaggerated Hollywood movies about evil, monstrous hordes destroying everything. Ancient Persia was absolutely nothing like that. Today, we are diving deep into the magnificent, highly organized, and surprisingly modern Achaemenid Empire. What does that actually mean? It means we're looking at the first real, stable, multicultural superpower the world had ever seen. The shocking facts we're about to explore prove they were doing things back then that we still struggle to manage today. Prepare to meet the real architects of global statecraft, human rights, and logistics, all painted in beautiful watercolor, of course. Fact number 1, a map that will completely break your ancient history brain. We usually get super impressed by the Roman Empire, right? But the Achaemenid Empire was monstrously bigger, and they did it way earlier. Imagine a map that goes from modern-day India all the way to Greece, and from the snowy mountains of Russia down to the scorching deserts of Egypt and Sudan. We are talking over 5.5 million square kilometers of territory. That is mind-boggling for an era relying solely on horses. But the real shocker isn't just the sheer landmass, it is the population. Historians' estimates suggest a truly staggering fact that around 44% of the entire human population of Earth lived under Persian rule at its absolute peak. Yes, almost half of humanity. Think about that for a second. Almost half the world responding to a single throne. It completely breaks our modern understanding of ancient demographics. When you realize that sheer, unimaginable scale, you start understanding our second fact, Cyrus the Great. But who was he and how did he do it? Fact number 2, Cyrus the Great. He wasn't your typical ancient conqueror who just marched in and burned things down. He was the founding father of this massive empire. But his primary approach to ruling wasn't brute force. It was radical tolerance. Imagine conquering a rival city and not enslaving everyone. Mind-blowing, right? In the ancient world, that was basically unheard of. Everyone expected the worst when a new king rolled into town. But when Cyrus conquered the mighty city of Babylon in 539 BC, he did something entirely unprecedented. He freed the enslaved people, including the Jewish population who had been exiled there, and actually allowed them to return home. He even helped fund the rebuilding of their temples. Why? Because happy, prosperous subjects pay taxes and don't rebel. Smart. He documented these revolutionary decrees on a baked clay artifact that we now call the Cyrus cylinder. Because of its contents, many historians, and even the United Nations, consider this to be the world's first charter of human rights. He allowed all conquered lands to keep their own languages, their own religions, and their local customs. Diversity wasn't seen as a weakness or a problem to be eradicated by the Persian kings. Instead, it was their ultimate competitive advantage. They turned the Middle East into a massive melting pot of global talent. You had Babylonian astronomers studying the stars, Egyptian doctors advancing medicine, and Greek engineers building monuments, all working for one king. It's like having the ancient world's ultimate Avengers team, though balancing all those hats could get complicated. But this radical policy of tolerance created unprecedented stability, which was crucial because maintaining this giant required our next shocking fact: logistics. Fact number 3, the ancient equivalent of the internet. Seriously, when you rule half the known world, communication is your biggest nightmare. Imagine trying to send an urgent royal order from the capital city of Susa all the way to a governor in India. Best case scenario, it takes months. Worst case, your messenger gets eaten by a lion or robbed by bandits in the wilderness. That simply wouldn't work for a highly organized superpower. Enter our next major historical player, King Darius I. Darius was less of a soft-hearted conqueror and more of an absolute strategic genius with a mild obsession for logistics and spreadsheets. To solve the communication crisis, he launched one of the most massive infrastructure projects in human history up to that point. He didn't invent roads, of course, but he completely revolutionized them, creating what became known as the legendary Royal Road. We're not talking about some bumpy dirt track through the wilderness. This was a standardized, meticulously planned highway system. The Royal Road stretched for a staggering 2,700 kilometers, from Sardis near the Aegean Sea all the way to Susa in Iran. It was heavily patrolled by guards to keep travelers safe, well marked with distance markers, and engineered to be as direct as geographically possible. To put that in perspective, if you drove that distance today, it would take you around 30 straight hours in a modern car. But doing it on foot or horseback in the ancient world, that was a terrifying, monumental journey that took ordinary travelers 3 whole months. Darius's road was a marvel, connecting the vast empire physically. But the pavement itself wasn't the real innovation here. The true genius was what he built along the road to utilize it. He essentially created the world's first high-speed data transfer system. Which brings us to our next shocking truth. Get ready to meet the ancient heroes who outpaced even the Romans. The Persian Postal Service. Fact number 4. Ancient Persia ran a postal service that was so incredibly fast and efficient. Even Roman generals centuries later could only dream of it. The Romans were famous for their roads, sure, but the Persians built the original ultimate high-speed delivery network using a brilliant system, the relay. Instead of sending one poor guy to ride thousands of miles until he literally collapsed, the system, called the Perdazish, worked like a modern relay race. A highly trained rider would take the royal message and travel at absolute maximum speed for a full day's journey. They would arrive at specific post stations, which were strategically spaced roughly 25 kilometers apart along the entire route. Without wasting a single second, they would hand the message satchel off to a brand new, completely fresh messenger sitting on a rested horse. They didn't stop for the night. They didn't stop for meals. They just kept riding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The famous Greek historian Herodotus, who usually didn't like the Persians very much, was so incredibly impressed by this system, he wrote, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Wait, does that quote sound familiar to you? It should. The United States Postal Service literally uses this exact translation as their unofficial motto today. These guys were communicating across continents at speeds that would not be beaten by any civilization for almost 2,000 years. If the king sent an absolutely urgent message, it covered the entire 2,700-kilometer royal road in just 9 days. 9 days! Imagine organizing that level of logistics using nothing but horses and clay tablets. It's an absolute miracle. But what about their military? Fact number 5. The original special forces. When we think of the ancient Persian military today, we usually jump straight to pop culture and that one movie where they get kicked into a giant well by Spartans at Thermopylae. But their elite royal guard was truly fascinating, highly organized, and completely terrifying. Meet the legendary Immortals. These guys were the ancient world's ultimate shock troops, serving a dual role as both the heavy infantry and the king's personal bodyguards. Now, why were they called Immortals? Did they have some sort of dark magic, or maybe a secret immortality potion hidden in their canteens? No, unfortunately not. The truth is actually a lot more bureaucratic, but in a psychological way, it was absolute genius. The unit was strictly mandated to consist of exactly 10,000 men at all times. Not one more, not one less. If a soldier retired, fell sick, or was lost in battle, there was absolutely zero gap in the formation. Another highly trained reserve warrior would step into his exact place instantly, seamlessly filling the gap as if nothing happened. To an opposing army, it looked like this elite force never took casualties. It was brilliant psychological warfare. Their HR department must have worked overtime. Their primary role was deeply prestigious. They were the ultimate shield for the king himself, marching closely alongside the royal chariot in complete silence. They wore brightly colored robes, but carried devastating weaponry, short swords, composite bows, and their signature tall spears with a shiny silver apple counterweight. Imagine standing on a battlefield, watching a literal endless sea of identical, highly disciplined warriors marching silently toward you without ever breaking formation. The Immortals were the physical manifestation of the state's power. They were the undeniable, terrifying muscles of the Achaemenid Empire. But massive superpower needs more than just muscle to survive. If they were the fists, who were the eyes and ears? Fact number 6, the world's first true intelligence agency. You see, managing an empire this incredibly huge came with a massive administrative headache. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor called a satrap. These guys had enormous local power. And with great power comes a great temptation to hoard tax money, build your own army, and start a rebellion. To prevent this, King Darius created an independent, super-secret network of inspectors who reported to absolutely no one except the king himself. They were officially known by a terrifyingly cool title, the eyes and ears of the king. Sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel. These inspectors would travel throughout the empire, mostly unannounced, conducting surprise audits on local governments. Imagine you're a corrupt official enjoying a lavish stolen dinner, and suddenly the king's personal auditor kicks open your door. And you couldn't just bribe or threaten them, because these spies traveled with their own armed military escorts. They were virtually untouchable. It's basically the ancient equivalent of the NSA, just with cooler hats and a lot more stabbing. They didn't have wiretaps or surveillance drones, but their intelligence gathering was shockingly systematic. Remember that ultra-fast postal service we talked about? The spies used it exclusively to send encrypted reports straight to the capital. This meant the king had a constant, rapid flow of data from all corners of his empire, keeping him steps ahead of any treason. The psychological effect was massive. Governors were constantly paranoid, never knowing if their own servants were secretly eyes of the king. This brilliant system of oversight and rapid communication kept this wildly diverse, massive empire stable and functioning for over 2 centuries. They had the roads, the mail, the army, and the spies. But how on earth did they pay for all of this without going bankrupt? Time for our final facts. Fact number 7, the original dollar standard. To run a massive, diverse superpower, you can't just rely on pillaging your neighbors. Before the Persians, international trade was a chaotic mess of bartering. Imagine trying to trade 3 Egyptian chickens for a lump of Babylonian silver. Once again, King Darius I, our favorite ancient spreadsheet nerd, hated this inefficiency. He wanted globalized, frictionless business. So, he introduced a universally accepted gold coin called the Daric. It was remarkably pure and had his face on it, holding a bow. The Daric became the standard currency of the ancient world. It was so reliable that mercenaries and merchants everywhere demanded to be paid in it. It was the ancient equivalent of a US dollar today. Suddenly, doing international business wasn't a nightmare. It was incredibly streamlined. A merchant in Babylonia could now effortlessly trade spices with a merchant in Egypt without losing half their value on complicated currency exchanges. But Darius didn't stop at coins. He also introduced a universally standardized system of weights and measures across the entire empire. No more arguing over whose pound of grain was heavier. Everyone used the royal standard. It was fair, predictable, and highly taxable. Ah yes, taxes. Taxation in the Achaemenid Empire wasn't just random tribute demanded by a warlord. It was carefully calculated based on land productivity. They employed an army of scribes who meticulously recorded every single transaction, yield, and payment on clay tablets. Bureaucracy at its finest. All of this wealth flowed directly into the royal treasuries at Persepolis and Susa, making the Persian kings unimaginably, absurdly wealthy. We're talking swimming in a literal pool of gold coins levels of wealthy. Do not try that at home, by the way. It hurts. This incredibly efficient economic engine is what truly funded the roads, the postal service, the Immortals, and the massive palace complexes. They were the perfect administrative superpower. But if they had the best economy, the best spies, and the best army, why did they collapse? Like all great stories, even the most massive and seemingly invincible empires eventually collapse under their own weight. The Achaemenids were no exception. Over the next 2 centuries, that beautifully efficient bureaucracy became horribly bloated. The once perfect system slowly turned into a tangled mess of corruption. Those perfectly calculated taxes, they just kept getting higher and higher, brutally crushing the everyday citizens and sparking numerous internal rebellions across the provinces. Furthermore, the quality of the kings dropped drastically. Later rulers were far more interested in luxurious palace, lounging, than managing complex logistics or armies. These deep internal fractures left the empire severely weakened. Right at the exact moment, a highly ambitious and aggressive young man decided to invade. Enter a young Macedonian commander named Alexander the Great. In 334 BC, he swept through the vast Middle Eastern territories like an unstoppable hurricane. Alexander formally conquered the Achaemenid Empire, ultimately burning the grand palace of Persepolis. But here's the most fascinating twist of our entire story. The Persian Empire physically fell, but its ingenious systems absolutely did not. Alexander actually adopted their entire administrative blueprint because it was flawlessly efficient. The Achaemenid legacy is completely undeniable. They proved to history that a massive, wildly diverse global superpower could actually function, cooperate, and flourish together. Through radical cultural tolerance, unparalleled logistical infrastructure, and a highly structured, standardized government, they laid the permanent foundation for all modern statecraft. From their incredible royal road to their systemic intelligence agencies, the concepts they pioneered became the direct blueprint for every empire that followed. They were definitely not the mindless evil movie villains. They were the world's first true diverse superpower. And that, my friends, is genuinely shocking. Thank you for flying through ancient history with me today. If your mind was thoroughly blown, make sure to like and subscribe for more. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have exactly 10,000 gold Daric coins to count, and this ancient wooden calculator is really, really slow. Wait a second. Did the Persians invent the number 0? No, that was India. Oh boy, this math is going to take a while.